Okay. There'll be no slides today, and that has nothing to do with the fact that I screwed them all up last time. And particularly toward the end, we'll be moving really fast, and that has nothing to do with the fact that we get to the material I know the least about. So again, remember, we're talking now not about memory, but history. And one of the things I tried to get you to think about last time was the centrality of slavery to the creation and expansion of the American Republic. And I think that's important to remember. It's not this sort of aberration. It is an aberration, but it's not just an aberration. And then we talked about the fact that it was central to American society, but it was absolutely central to shaping the views of the white South before the Civil War. And it's the preservation of slavery that leads the South to secede. So that the Civil War is an attempt by the white South to create an independent slaveholding republic, which is not at all what Civil War memory has tended to emphasize of late. The end of the war brings emancipation. And I didn't talk much about that, but I want to. One of the issues I raised at the very first time we talked is how you deal with what changes and what doesn't change. And I think it's very easy, and I think some historians encourage this, to minimize the importance of emancipation in and of itself. The end of slavery is a significant and a major change that's fundamentally important. It's even more of a change, as I try to get you to think about, with the Reconstruction that followed the Civil War, at least the second stage of Reconstruction with Congressional Reconstruction. Now, one thing I didn't talk about last time about Reconstruction that I think it's important to mention real quickly, and that is Reconstruction brings the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. A historian by the name of Eric Foner has recently referred to those as the second founding. And he points out where the Bill of Rights are rights that you are protected by government to keep, that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are designed to ensure, to use government to provide and protect your rights, a very different function. And if you've been watching all of the obituary movies about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you'll immediately remember how important the 14th Amendment is to her career in terms of shaping the law on sexual discrimination. So in and of itself, that's an important change. Secondly, in Congressional Reconstruction, you have a 2 to 8 year, depending on which state, experiment in biracial politics. And so you have more freedom than you ever had for African Americans, but you've got the vote, you've got a functioning biracial democracy that works for 6 to 8 years or 2 to 8 years, depending on which state you're talking about, and will not return again at least until the 1970s or then. So again, this period of Reconstruction is not the evil failure that the Lost Cause promoted, but rather a successful, for a time, experiment in biracial democracy that I think it's important to remember. Now, again, it ends in large measure because the North loses interest for a variety of reasons, and the white South unifies behind the Democratic Party. And when it can win politically, takes control that way. When it can't, it uses political terrorism to take control. Again, thousands of people died so that the white Democrats could regain control of the South by 1877. So I think it's important to remember that. The other thing that I want to stress, because it'll come back again today, is again, what Reconstruction did not involve was any redistribution of land in the South. In other words, after 200 years of slavery, 4 million African Americans are freed with no capital, with nothing to have shown in the accumulation of wealth for their role in building America. So then I look very quickly at the economic system, in part trying to remind you that the Southern poverty that emerges in the 20s and 30s, that is so deep and so influential, is not the result of the war, but the result of the decisions made by the white elite to remain committed to the cotton economy, to create a system of the exploitation of black labor in sharecropping and tenantry, magnified from the 90s on in the international drop in the price of cotton, so that you have an incredibly poor region by the 1900s. With that comes as well, if you are going to build your economy over the exploitation of cheap labor, then you don't bother to invest in education. So again, there's very little tradition of investment in the human capital of the South because of the nature of that system. On the other hand, don't forget, some people made a lot of money. So again, this highly structured wealth and poverty that still plagues areas of the South is a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, the one aspect of that post-war adjustment that I didn't mention that's fundamental to what we're talking about, I was trying to get to it and didn't, is crime. Most importantly, the definition of crime. So during the early days of Reconstruction, there'd been police forces before, there'd been prisons before, but the white South now, with 4 million people who used to be handled by private discipline on the plantation, have to be dealt with in terms of public policy. So you begin to create police forces, and often those police forces become involved in the control of Black lives. And the very definition of crime expands in ways that you may hear echoes today. I meant to tell you at the beginning, there are all kinds of echoes in this talk all the way through, and I'm going to try to resist making all the parallels to today and say you that. But they begin to expand crime, and particularly they use vagrancy statutes and loitering statutes as a way to arrest Blacks, and often then put them to work on plantations. We'll talk more about that in a second. So you expand crime as a period goes on, trying to keep Blacks dependent on white employers, for instance. So you have some of the first gun control in the South, and they try to keep guns out of the hands of Black people so they can't hunt and get their own food. And then they have bans on hunting. Some of the first environmental legislation in the South is actually an attempt to control Black people. So from the very beginning, in the wake of the Civil War, law enforcement becomes a means to try to control African Americans and African Americans' labor. And you begin to see a pattern that persists. In the late 19th century, Blacks represented 16% of the population and 34% of the prisoners. The most egregious form of that control was something called the convict labor system. In an attempt to make money for state governments, to promote economic development, many Southern states, almost all Southern states, adopted a system of convict labor. In other words, private companies would come to the state and essentially rent prisoners for a year. And then they would control those prisoners. They put them to work on plantations, in mining industries, and timber industries. It was an uncommonly brutal system, with probably in many areas 20% mortality in a year. So if you were a prisoner sentenced for vagrancy, you could be rented out as a convict to a private company, and your chances of dying during your service were 1 in 5. Now, Reconstruction may or may not end in 1877, depending on how you want to talk about it. But the system doesn't close down in 1877. The system really closes down, and you have the creation of a new, what I call rigid repressive racial order. Not at the end of Reconstruction, but between 1890 and about 1910. How you talk about this, what you call this rigid repressive racial order, is tricky. You notice I keep saying rigid repressive racial order. The terms you most often hear are Jim Crow or segregation. Jim Crow, to me, makes a horrendous system sound kind of cute, and I find it misleading. I don't like segregation either. Segregation suggests separation, that what this system was about was keeping people apart. One of the things that segregation makes possible is cheap labor, which means more middle-class white people had maids in Atlanta than they did in Boston. Now, when you bring a Black woman into your house to be your maid, and she fixes your food, and she takes care of your children, and she runs a very severe risk of being sexually exploited by the man of the house, you're not talking about separation. You're talking about exploitation. Another example, we'll talk about the Great Migration. When Blacks begin to leave the South in 1914 or 1915, If it was about separation, whites should have been jumping up and down saying, yippee, 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 they're leaving, we'll be separated. Instead, you find examples of them going to the train station and forcibly pulling blacks off the train to stop that migration because they want them as their laborers. So the system we're talking about is really not about separation as much as it is about exploitation and control. Exploitation and control, racial exploitation and racial control. I think segregation, this rigid repressive system, is different than slavery, but those echoes of the same second attempt to control African Americans, I think, are valid. So why now in the late 19th century? Several reasons. First of all, between 1900 and the early 20th century is in a period of incredibly racist thought, not just in the South, but in American culture and really in Western culture. So this is a period of, if you know about it, of scientific racism, where they were taking the nations of the world and making charts to show which ones were at the top and which were at the bottom. And as you might guess, Africans were at the bottom. In America itself, you have a fascinating movement of people who watched emancipation and said, well, what you're going to have after emancipation is regression. Some of them thought blacks would simply die out, and they had statistics that made them believe that. Others thought that what you had were people who were innately given to crime. And they particularly thought mixed race people were uncommonly given to crime. And then they went and did statistical studies that showed blacks were, in fact, more likely to give in to crime. And again, these are not a bunch of Southern racists sitting around the bar. These are Harvard sociologists. These are the head of the US Census. This is the chief statistician for the Providence Insurance Company, making these notions that blacks are inherently given to crime. Again, this relationship between blackness and crime in the white mind is deep and persistent. So first of all, you have this creation of a new rigid racial order because of this intense period of racism. At its worst at this point, there were racists, particularly in the South, who thought the solution to the race problem was colonization, that all blacks should be forced to leave the country. Others took more moderate stands. The worst form of this racism was to turn African Americans, particularly African American males, into the black beast rapist, which was a very popular notion in popular culture. So you had this incredible period of racism at the turn of the century. Second, and very important, is that the federal government sends signals that they will no longer interfere in Southern race relations. Starting even before the 1890s, culminating in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 that you all probably know about, the Supreme Court slowly but surely makes the 13th, well, we're not really the 13th, but the 14th and 15th Amendments are irrelevant for race in the South. In other words, the courts are saying, we're not going to interfere in Southern race relations. Probably more important in explaining the timing. In 1890, Congress debates what came to be called the Force Bill. It was a bill that would provide for federal oversight of Southern elections. White Southerners had already begun to try to eliminate black voting through various subterfuges. And the Republican Party in Congress debates creating a federal authority to go in and stop that. And that bill fails. Shortly thereafter, Congress repeals some of the Reconstruction measures for enforcement of protection of blacks in the South. So in 1890, Congress is in effect saying, and the Republican Party, which was the party most closely aligned with African American rights, they're saying the federal government's not going to intervene anymore. And for white Southerners, that was a blank check to move. At the same time, the third factor is equally important, and that is white Southerners see a need for some sort of change in the system. They're afraid of African Americans. And those fears are based on two things for me. One is of a resurgence of black political power. The Populist Party, which was an alliance of small farmers in the South and West who offered a radical vision of a changed federal government, made noises. They appealed to black voters. They said small farming whites and blacks should work together to change America. They don't always live up to that, the whites don't. But that threat of a renewed black political power frightens the South. And that's one of the reasons they see the need for this new repressive racial order. The other factors are interesting. If I had been given this talk when I first started teaching, you would have gotten all kind of psychosocial, it's all tied to sex, gender, all this kind of crap. None of which I believe are important anymore. What the white South is afraid of is black progress. Despite what happens after the Civil War and the horrors of that system, you had substantial black progress in the South by 1900. Literacy had gone up from 5 to 50%. Land ownership had gone up to 20%. It's really an amazing story of a group of people raising themselves by their own bootstraps in the midst of a terribly repressive system. But I think that progress scares whites. So what whites are really worried about in the 1890s is black progress and the assertion of black power, and they feel like they have to retake control. And so they create this system that has three parts to it. This rigid repressive racial order. The first is, to me, the least important, and that's segregation. It tended to be urban and town-based. In other words, with the new commercial culture and shops and all this stuff, we'll create segregation so that we won't mix with each other. By this time, school segregation had already begun. By this time, almost all churches had segregated long before this. So the segregation laws are important, but they're not central. The second aspect is central, and that's a systematic attempt to disfranchise blacks. They wrote new constitutions, which included all kinds of clauses that never mentioned race, so they were not in violation of the 15th Amendment, but stopped black voting. Morals clauses, property clauses, most prominently literacy clauses. In other words, you had to be able to read to vote. I was listening to a Zoom on Friday by Randall Kennedy, and he told the story that they had a literacy clause when you would go and they'd ask a white person to spell cat and a black person to spell chrysanthemum. My favorite was a joke that went through the black community of Mississippi in the 1920s and 30s, where a black PhD goes to register to vote, and they say, well, you got to prove you can read, and they hand him a Chinese newspaper. And he picks the newspaper up, and he looks it upside down, right side up, so he hands it back. And the register of voters says what it to say, and the black PhD says, it says no black folks voting in Mississippi this year. So the use of the registration procedure, which were under state control, allowed these clauses to be used in discriminatory fashion, but they were designed to keep blacks from voting. You also have other factors. The poll tax. You had to pay a tax to vote. And the tax was cumulative. So if you didn't vote for 4 years, you had to pay the tax for 4 years. So sometimes by the time you went to vote, you'd owe a tax bill of $8 on what would have been an income of about $100. If all that didn't work, they come up in the early 20th century with the white primary. By that time, blacks were almost all Republicans, whites were all Democrats. And so the Democratic Party had a primary, and only whites could vote in it. And whoever won that primary then won the general election because there weren't enough Republican votes to make a difference. So basically what happens with disfranchisement is between 1890 and about 1910, throughout almost every southern state, you systematically eliminate almost all black people from voting. So the rate of black voting goes down across the South to about 4%. That will not change until the Voting Rights Act of 65. Doesn't really change until 1970. So roughly for 70, 80 years, no white politician ever had to think about what a black person thought about his policies. And no black elected officials had power. Segregation, disfranchisement. And the third aspect of this new repressive racial order was violence, white violence. This is the era of lynching. Lynching, which in the 80s had been a white and Western phenomenon, becomes a black and Southern phenomenon. So particularly in the 1890s, and particularly in the early 1890s, you had over 100 lynchings per year in the South. So roughly, again, there was one lynching to every 3 to 4 days somewhere in the South. Some of them were relatively private, small groups who took out a black person and killed them. More often, or not more often, but equally important, they were public, with trains that brought people to watch, and thousands of people watching a black person hanged and then burned, with some of those white people taking souvenirs like bone joints and other things out of the burning mats, usually often with a sign, because lynching was not just about individual blacks, but maintaining control. So it was an example for every African American. Lynching was justified by the defense of the rape of white women. Probably only a third of black people lynched were even accused of rape, much less whether they were guilty or not. So you had lynching. You had racial rioting by whites. Again, in the last few weeks, you've heard so much about the Tulsa riot, which comes a little later than this. But in 1898, for the Democrats to take control, there's a white riot in Wilmington, get racists in the streets killing black people. In 1900 in New Orleans, after an incident between a black man and white police officers, you have 3 days of rioting in New Orleans, in which, again, you race through black neighborhoods killing black people by whites. Atlanta, the city too busy to hate, in 1906 has a major race riot in which almost 100 black people are killed and 3,000 leave Atlanta once the riot's over. Happened in other cities as well. So you have lynching and you have white racial violence. But you also have day-to-day violence. There was a constant threat of violence by white people against black people throughout this 70-year period. And again, this is another place where policing becomes part of the story, because part of the police responsibility in any southern small town and in most southern urban areas was to control the black population, to protect the white community from what they saw as the danger of blacks. Within the black community, policing was much different. There was a great deal of corruption. There was much more likelihood of the acceptance of black on black crime than there was black on white crime. So the police departments of most southern cities and most southern small towns, which were almost always all white, become part of this system of racial control. There's some reform, using the reform ironically, in that by this time, most southern states abandoned the convict leasing system, in part because of corruption rather than any care for whites. It's replaced with a chain gang, an image of black criminality that's still pretty strong in American society, certainly on the LSU campus when they come in to clean up after football games. And this is when Angola is created. This is when parchment is created. Again, I hesitate to see all this as a new slavery, but boy, when they start making prisons, plantations, it makes it hard for them. So again, between 1890 and 1900, what you have is the creation of this rigid, repressive racial order based on segregation, but more importantly on disfranchisement and racial violence and the control of black people. And part of this, the maintenance of that system is law enforcement and the police. Now, at about, well, not at the same time, toward the end of that, you have another fundamental change in American race relations. It's what I like to call the Americanization of race. In the 1890s, when all of this is going on, 90% of African Americans still lived in the South. In 1970, when this comes to an end, 53% of African Americans live in the South. So you've had this gigantic shift in demographics over the course of the first half of the 20th century. Jerry mentioned some of this earlier in one of the earlier talks, but you have two great migrations. Between about 1915 and 1930, you have the first great migration of African Americans out of the South into the primarily the cities of the middle states and New England, the Midwest, and the far West. There's a great deal of migration west. Baton Rouge, for instance, a lot of Baton Rouge African Americans who live in either the first or second migration go west. So there are close ties between Baton Rouge African American community and the Los Angeles African American communities. But the first migration is generated by two things. One is World War I. One of the contributing factors to Southern poverty was what one historian has called a separate labor market. In other words, most of the industrial jobs when America industrializes in the late 19th and early 20th century were filled by immigrants, often with chain migration directly from the European countries, and very little migration of blacks or whites out of the South into those jobs. World War I cuts off that chain migration out of Europe, and so the need for jobs draws some whites and a lot of blacks north. But the other reason for the first migration is the creation of that new racial order. In other words, one response to this new, rigid, repressive, very dangerous system is to move north. And many blacks do. So you have the first great migration. The second great migration is between World War II and about 1970. And in fact, since 1970, the migrations have reversed. Since 1970, there are more blacks leaving the north or the south than they are going the other direction. The second migration is, the second great migration, is the result of several things. Most importantly, New Deal agricultural policy. The New Deal agricultural policy involved two things. One was limitation on how much cotton you could grow as an individual farmer, and huge subsidy payments to those farmers not to grow cotton. So when you took land out of production, you needed fewer workers. And when you had that big check from the federal government, you could buy a tractor, which meant you laid even fewer workers. And then after World War II, it gets even better because you can buy a mechanical cotton picker. And with a mechanical cotton picker, you needed even fewer workers. So as you have a shift away from the need for agricultural labor, a lot of African Americans leave the South again for the cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West. And that really changes the notion of where race is an issue in America. Now, to a certain extent, the North represented greater freedom, probably a little less danger of personal violence. One big shift is in the North, African Americans could vote. But we've increasingly come to realize that through zoning laws, residential restrictions, and other things, you very quickly in the North create a segregated society as well. And in that world where you have various housing patterns to limit that, again, the police in the cities of the North begin to fulfill some of the same functions you have in the South in terms of controlling black people. Particularly in the second migration, history plays a very dirty trick on African Americans, as it has almost throughout its whole history. And that is the second migration of African Americans out of the rural South into the urban centers of the North comes at the same time that you have deindustrialization. In other words, the jobs that had been the attraction in the first migration are now moving south and offshore. So at the same time, African Americans flock into the area where you traditionally had jobs, the jobs themselves have disappeared. I would add here another aspect of this. Keep that in mind. That's true for African Americans, not just in the North, but also in the South. Here, my organization doesn't work very well, I apologize. And that is beginning in the New Deal, beginning in the 1930s. You have a dramatic increase in federal aid to individuals, almost all of which go to whites. There's a political scientist who's written a book with a wonderful title, When Affirmative Action Was for Whites. And that's this story. In part, it's because of Southern political influence. The South has enough power, white Southern Democrats have enough power in the 1930s Congress to block things. And so they use that power to keep their control over African Americans. So most New Deal programs were segregated. Most New Deal programs involved more aid for whites than for blacks. It was still more aid for African Americans than it ever had before. And in fact, it's the New Deal and that aid and Eleanor Roosevelt's commitment to biracial justice that begins the process of shifting African American voters out of the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But if you look at the key aspects of the way in which the federal government plays a role in creating family wealth, you find incredible discrimination. Take something as simple as Social Security. Social Security Act provided old age help, provided aid to dependent children, which was the first version of welfare, and provided unemployment insurance. Under the Social Security Act as originally passed, agriculture and domestic workers were not covered. White Southern politicians keep the majority of black labor from being covered by Social Security. Social Security was a federal program. Aid for dependent children, unemployment insurance are regulated by the states. Again, one of the reasons they think so highly of states' rights is states' rights provides a way to control black people. So even something as fundamental as the Social Security Act, you can see the difference. More importantly are two kinds of programs that I want to talk about briefly. One is housing. Beginning in the New Deal, you have a tremendous program of providing support for housing for middle-class Americans, including one of the great ways to help generate wealth, which you buy a home and you get a mortgage deduction on your taxes, which helps you do that. And so there's the Federal Housing Administration. There's an attempt to provide middle-class housing. Aid for the poor took the form of apartments, created great tenement stuff. Very different there. But under the FHA, and in the South as well as in the North, with almost always the cooperation of state and local government, you find discriminatory lending programs. When you, after World War II, have the great creation of the suburbs with places like Levittown, which would mass produce housing cheaply. All of those major developments outside of Philadelphia, outside of New York, had restrictive covenants. You could not sell those houses to black people. And the FHA went along with that. And the FHA and the banks practiced what you've heard about so much, redlining. And even the FHA was fine even if you tried to build a subdivision too close to a black neighborhood, you couldn't get federal funding. So again, if you talk about the accumulation of family wealth, for most of us, our homes are a tremendous part of that. And here you have federal programs designed to create that wealth, and African Americans are systematically discriminated against within them. The other federal program, so often and so rightly credited with generating the great American middle class after World War II, was the GI Bill, veterans benefits. Again, for housing and for education. Again, a program in which African Americans are not treated fairly at all and do not benefit in the way whites do. So that you have these major programs that create generational wealth, which African Americans, for the most part, have been left out. So the hope of the first migration, and to some extent the hope of the second migration, that somehow the North was going to be dramatically different, doesn't altogether work out. And I think you see that most vividly. And I think it's the moment when America really begins to say, this is a national, not a Southern problem. With the violent unrest in American cities between 64 and 68, which some of you looking at your young faces may remember. I went back Friday and looked at the Kerner Commission, the study at the end of that as to what was going on. And given our current situation, part of it was incredibly fascinating. When the commission looked at the underlying cause of the riots, in 40% of the cases, it involved the behavior of the police. When they looked at the immediate cause of the riot, in 50%, half the time it was set off by some incident between the Black community and the police force. Now, at the same time that's going on, in 64 and 65, you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Those two laws make illegal the racial order that was created between 1890 and 1910. And those two laws are primarily directed against the South. One of the things always fascinates me that nobody talks about much in the Civil Rights Act, one of the most important things is it gives the federal government the right to file suit to desegregate schools. One of the problems with desegregation was if you were a Black plaintiff in a desegregation case, you took your life in your own hands, so that to let the federal government do it was a tremendous advance. The Republican Party's right. The Republican Party provides the votes to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, one of the things that Northern representatives insisted on was that right for the federal government to bring desegregation suits only applied in de jure segregation. In other words, segregation by law, not de facto segregation. In other words, protecting Northern school segregation from federal influence at the same time they demanded it for the South. But in any case, I digress. I want to mention those two acts because, again, one of the things that I think is important in all of this, that I don't think gets enough emphasis in the current political debate, is that change can and does happen. And the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act do make substantial changes in American society. I would say there are three. One is the whole role of Blacks in American politics is dramatically changed by the Voting Rights Act. The number of Black office holders, the Black political interpretation. We've seen it in our debate on something as insignificant as a debate over Confederate symbolism. In other words, Blacks have the political power to make that an issue, which they would not have had in 1940. That's important. The second thing that's really hard to quantify because nobody knows what the hell the middle class means. But you've had a dramatic increase in the size of the African-American middle class since World War II, and particularly since the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. In the rigid repressive racial order, the middle class in most states, Black middle class, was probably somewhere around 8 to 12%. And of the Black middle class, probably 8 and 10 of them were either ministers or school teachers. Probably 3 times as many African Americans could be defined as middle class today as at the height of segregation. I think that's an important change. You even had a degree of public integration. Not so much private integration, but public integration. So those laws did make a difference. And I think it's important to realize. I mean, one of the things I've stressed over and over again is the shape of all this changes. Unfortunately, it can go bad as well as good, but this was good. The irony, and I didn't realize this as much as I should have, even before I started working on this the last couple of days. The amazing thing is, even as you set off those changes, you begin to have the reaction, the white reaction against racial change. So that even before you pass the Civil Rights Act, you've got George Wallace becoming a national figure. Barry Goldwater the next year runs for president. Nixon runs on law and order. So that even as you have the beginnings of this change, you have the beginnings of the white backlash, with Wallace especially pioneering ways to talk about race without using the word. And that remains an important strand in American politics that we are wrestling with today. But you also have, almost at the beginning, and this is the part that I just had sort of repressed, I guess. From the very beginning, part of that reaction is a focus on crime. Even under Lyndon Johnson, who deserves enormous credit for racial change in American society, with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, who understood the realities of race better than probably any president we've ever had. Even under Lyndon Johnson, you begin to have anti-crime legislation in the 1960s. And you begin to fund the police as never before. You begin to talk about black criminality as never before. That increase in the funding of police by the federal government for local police increases in the 1970s. And then it takes a gigantic jump under Reagan and the war on drugs. When Reagan declares war on drugs, polling showed that only 2% of Americans saw drugs as a major problem. And the war on drugs is very quickly shifted to race as well. So within the Justice Department, there's a shift from an emphasis on white collar crime to street crime. Again, you have more federal funding for local police. You begin to have particularly the provision of military equipment to police, of militarization of the police, which is a real fundamental change. In 1984, you have a law that allows the police to seize property used in a crime and keep it and sell it. And that's usually against drug dealers frequently as a means to raise money for police forces. In 1986, you have the drug law that provided for mandatory sentences for drug dealing, and also the provision I'm sure you're all familiar with, in which crack and powdered cocaine are treated very differently in terms of the amounts of sentences, sometimes as much as 10 to 1. So that crack cocaine, which is a street drug and more likely to be among black neighborhoods, becomes a source of a much longer period of jail than if you were a white middle-class person or upper-class person with powdered cocaine. Now, all of that is helping foment crime, making drugs a major crime where it hadn't been. But you've also had all the structural problems that we saw exploding in the cities in the 1960s. And crime was real, and there was a gigantic doubling of crime between the late 1960s and 1991. Since then, it's gone down, which everybody tends to forget, but the crime is real. And so the Clinton response is to continue that trend, and particularly what you're going to hear about item for item, I'm willing to bet, in the coming campaigns. The 1994 crime bill goes further. I do think it's important to remember that one of the great tragedies of all this is that we've created a system in which there is a tension between the African-American community and the police force, when in many ways it's often the African-American community, because of the structural racism and poverty, that's most in need of the police force. And the evidence is overwhelming. The 58% of blacks in polling supported the 1994 Crime Act. 2/3 of the Congressional Black Caucus voted for it. In cities like DC that were primarily under the control of whites, there was a tremendous fear of crime. So all of that stuff was real, but again, it makes it worse. And so you have what has become in many ways a part of this, the system of mass incarceration. That's so much a part of the current tension. So let me go back. The association of crime and blackness has deep roots. Remember from the very beginning in Africa, the white image of the black, the image in the white mind of blacks was savage. Remember what I just said about the 1890s, when you have the host of social scientists proving what they see is innate criminality. At the same time, crime is rooted in systemic factors. And one of the things that I've been trying to get you to think about with the history is you have the system of slavery, which is a system of racial control and exploitation. And you come out of slavery with absolutely no capital, no inherited wealth. You there quickly go into a rigid repressive racial order in a poverty-stricken region with no emphasis on education. And you have almost no attempt to build capital. And then, in terms of the real expansion of the American middle class, with the federal programs in housing and the GI Bill that expands wealth and family wealth, blacks are discriminated against that. So that when you look at modern American society, you can talk about a closing of gaps on income, though it's still there. But the amazing gap is in personal family wealth. And the difference there between whites and blacks, you see different figures, you do, but at its best, it's white family wealth is 10 to 11. In Louisiana, it's probably 13 or 14 times as high as that for black families. And that's the history I've been talking about. That's the accumulation of wealth over time. When you talk about systemic racism, it's the laws and it's the systems that have created that disparity that still exists. So we're back to George Floyd. You may have forgotten him. That's part of the title. So when George Floyd is killed by a police officer, what blacks see is the police's role in a long history of structural inequality in which law enforcement has often played a part in maintaining that structure. And so when they take to the streets to protest the police as part of the structure, it makes complete sense to them to see the Confederacy as another example of the same kind of systematic racism. So to deface and demand taking down of Confederate statues is, in their minds, part of the same thing. And they see those statues as well, as I've tried to show you, as an attempt in part, not just to promote white supremacy, but to deny that history. That ultimately was what the Lost Cause was all about, denying the history of racial exploitation and white supremacy. And if you remember the figures I gave you on who is most adamant about protecting the monuments, it's the people who want to continue to deny the importance of that history. So the shift to Confederate monuments as a symbol of white America's denial of structural racism, of their denial of the way African Americans have been treated, makes complete sense. I will, I think, unmute you and, well, I thought I did. I was trying to unmute you.
We can unmute ourselves.
Unmute yourselves and ask questions. Apparently, I'm not doing it very well. I'd like to point out I finished on time. Questions, disagreements?
James, have you read Isabel Wilkerson's book on the caste?
Not yet. I bought it, if that counts. I always try to use that explanation for my lack of reading.
Well, I just finished it. It's interesting because she basically says there's us and then there's the blacks. And the blacks are at the bottom in a caste system. And she doesn't deal with all the permutations that you have dealt with in terms of how that has evolved and changed over time. But it's an interesting book. It's well written. from a story point of view.
Yeah, I need to read it.
Her book on the Great Migration was well written.
Yeah, she's good.
James, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
In lieu of all this, what do you propose we do now?
Ooh, that's a good thing about being historians. We don't do that. You know, the only tangential, I mean, I think we have to address the problem of inherited wealth. In other words, if we don't deal with the economic aspect of it, it's not going to happen. I think we need to realize the importance of political coalitions and governmental action to change things. I think we need to pay attention to the past. I'll make all the parallels that I didn't make as we went along. I mean, you know, every time I think about the convict lease system, I'm shocked that a region that had that history would then privatize prisons. When I think about the moves toward disfranchisement and watch what's happened in American political elections since Heller, the need for federal oversight of Southern elections, the need for some sort of guarantee of Voting Rights Act has never been more important. I don't believe in I'm not big on, I mean, it's amazing to me how much the carceral state is related to drugs. And we may have to decriminalize certain aspects of drug possessions to stop some of that. I'm not sure where I am on reparations, but I think at least affirmative action as a form of reparations has to be part of the mix. And you got to have some sort of police reform to change that, which is going to be incredibly difficult. So those are the things everybody else says too.
Well, and what you observed earlier is that, you know, the war on crime, the war on drugs, all those things since the 70s, you know, both major parties are complicit in it.
Oh, yes.
And so just guaranteeing voting for one party is not necessarily going to give you a more enlightened outcome, unfortunately. It always seems to be a lesser of two evils choice.
That's a good Calvinist you should get.
Yeah, I suppose, but.
Gaines, one of the things that's happened over the last decades is that the inheritance tax has been weakened by raising the minimum income on which you have to pay an inheritance tax. Has that been, I mean, obviously that gives the federal government less money to give away to people who don't deserve it, but is that just too simple that nobody's brought up race as a factor? I mean, is it just too easy to sell?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Though, I mean, I get appalled by that. Though, my impression is there were so many loopholes around that it hadn't made it. I mean, I think a better question is higher tax rates for higher incomes in general. Mm-hmm. Would I think do better